University of Paris, Nantere, and coming as a professor of the university and also editor of the journal Ethnologie française. So we have a nice opportunity today to hear and to discuss this lecture on an important issue of anthropology of family, sociology of family, ethnology of family, which is actually the main area of research of Professor Martine Segalen. She did it for many years, and her publications are very much sounding on it. For example, Sociology of the Family, 9th edition comes, 9th already. So how many already done? History of the Family, also translated into many languages. Family and Kinship in Europe is one more. Love and Power in the Present Family, last one on top. Contemporary Rites and Rituals, also last book from 2017, the last edition, also translated in languages like Spanish. So we have today the best opportunity to meet and to discuss European anthropology, European ethnology, European sociology, from the expert on relations, networks of family, which are very nicely deconstructed in her approach. Approach is not institutional, approach is not functional, approach is not emotional. It comes with all those deconstructions and actually ends up probably with departing from David Schneider's perspective or approach. So in this way, family networks are seen as a sources of security and mutual assistance and the moral economy, and it comes from European research project. She was together with Patrick Heady coordinating, and it was 8 European countries covering, and a comparative perspective on how family networks could be sources of security and mutual assistance. So in this way, research at home in France in relation with the Museum of Folklore, Museum of Folk, National Museum of Folk Culture, probably best translation would be in English.
Yeah.
And the Center for Ethnologie. She was for 25 years there, and the last 10 years she was the director of the center. It's a research laboratory, research unit of the museum, the Center for Ethnologie. So, Center for Ethnologie is one, University of Paris as a professor too, and last but not least, editor of the very important journal, major journal of anthropology in France, Ethnologie française, editor of many volumes on different countries, mainly European countries like Portugal, Greece, or Slovenia, and eventually we come up with Lithuania. And today is opportunity to have both lecture on family networks, research on it for last 50 years, and presentation of the journal, which was kind of a very beloved baby of the editorial board, and particularly in the hands of a loving mother, Martine. So, very welcome.
Our baby.
Okay, thank you. So, have a look, please. And please.
Thank you. I hope it will not be too much for you to have 2 conferences in a row, but that I will stop after my talk on kinship and we can have a discussion, and then Vitis will present the journal. And I want to thank you for having me here in Kaunas, and I'm extremely pleased to be here because well, through the presentation of the journal, I've learned a lot about Kaunas, the history of the Department of Anthropology. So I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank Vitis for bringing me here, to thank also the French Institute in Vilnius for taking care of myself in Vilnius, where I will present this conference tomorrow also at the Institute of the Lithuanian Institute of History. So, and please, if I'm not clear, do not hesitate to interrupt me and ask questions. Actually, the course of my work over so many years, I will try to illustrate the changes in the family and the changes in the discipline of anthropology through 3 times of research which I conducted along this rather long life of research. The first theme I will develop, and this is how I started in anthropology, was studying the peasant kinship systems, and I want to show how it became part of something like a European anthropology. The second part I will develop will relate to this CAS program, CAS meaning kinship and social security, which was a European comparative program also. And as you know, in anthropology, we always want to try to compare, to understand better things and get out a little bit of our own local specificity. And then the third point I will develop is a point and a question, not a point, it's a question which is hotly debated in France, and I am proud enough to be part of that debate, which is on surrogacy, and that brings us back to the questions of filiation and descent, which are, as you know, very traditional topics of kinship, which must have been taught to you at the beginning of your studies. And Malinowski used to talk about the bastard algebra of kinship, which meant, you know, doing genealogies, finding about what are the names of this person in that generation and so on, and also discussing the questions of who is the son of whom, what rights, what duties, and so on. And this question of surrogacy that is popping up in our countries now, in European countries, but it is a worldwide question, is now hotly debated, and the anthropologists are really part of the discussion. For once, anthropologists are being asked to be part of a public debate, and this is rather, we often scream to be heard in public debates, so this is a case where anthropologists are heard. So the first point will be the question of peasant kinship system. And in the 70s, in French Academy, if you want to become an ethnologist or anthropologist, I'm not going to go into this discussion because this would be a whole topic by itself. Let's say if you wanted to be an anthropologist, you had to do kinship. And this was my luck as a young researcher to develop my research in the time of the development of historical demography, of the development of the historian school of Annales, which was attached to describing mentalities and daily life habits rather than studying kings and battles and kingdoms. And so, together with the development of an anthropological look, the 3 dimensions cohered to produce a wide array of knowledge regarding kinship in Europe. In the 50s, until the 50s, 60s, the concept of folklore was abandoned under Lévi-Strauss influence, mainly of course, and the researchers which were really geared toward material culture shifted to the study of social practices. And so French ethnology of France developed within a European framework of debates, among whom the most important impulse came from England, the Cambridge, the English School of Historical Demography, called the Cambridge Group for History of Population and Social Structure, and also the influence of the German school. So a host of research flourished that were based both on fieldwork and archive research. And that was my case. I worked on a on a specific area, westernmost of France in Brittany, called Le Pays Bigoudin. And I worked there on doing field work and archive research. And these researchers also cohered with the work done by young anthropologists of South Europe, Portugal and Spain, who developed also the same topic. And it was a time when a true comparative program could be set up, and it was a unique space for comparative research, given the fact that, you understand, it was only about rural peasant community, where each researcher within the conferences, the international conferences, would bring his or her material to compare the size of this, the size of households, and so on. The Cambridge group offered a grid to European scholars to study the diversity of family structures throughout Europe. So that was one comparative framework which was offered. Another one was associated with the work of French historians of law, Jean Hiver, and most notably known probably Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, who established a connection between family structures, family household, and the systems of inheritance. So the question of reproduction of the domestic group through either egalitarian systems between all siblings, including boys and girls who are equal, and then the existence of impartible systems where there is only one heir among all the children, was really hotly debated throughout many examples, and discussing the size of the household, the type of inheritance pattern, was connected to residential practices and, of course, marriage practices. So there were a lot of work of monographies that evolved from on all those topics, dealing with various communities of Southern Europe, Western Europe, and then later on, when research could be brought in from Eastern countries of Europe. I want to assess also the importance of the influence of a prominent social anthropologist, Jack Goody, who had compared, who first said, who showed the importance of the family household as what he called units of production and reproduction. And he called attention to the economic aspects of the household, who was doing what kind of work was done and so on. And it was very, I think it really was very influential in France, and it opened new avenues toward the reproduction of peasant society, when he explains that each residential unit at each generation has to solve the question of transfer of the property, transfer of the production, given the fact that in Western Europe, as of the 14th century, all lands were being accaparrated, I would say, occupied. I mean, there was no free land. Land was belonging to huge religious communities or to big landlords and so on. But Jack Goody set this comparison, which was so very important, between what he called Eurasia, Europe and Asia, against African societies, where in African societies you have land and you can move from one place to another. This is, of course, what I'm telling is, also, of course, a short summary of his idea, but the comparison is important. In Africa, you have poor soil, no mechanics, and you don't have any surpluses. And there you observe what he called the unilineal systems of inheritance, which means that the inheritance goes only through one line, either paternal lines or maternal lines. And in comparison, Europe, all the lands are being tilled, there is mechanical production, there are surpluses, they have to be distributed, and then we have what he calls the diverging devolution, which means that on the one hand in Africa you have unilinear devolution, in Eurasia diverging devolution, the consequence of which in Buddhist terms is that women get endowed, get lands when they're married and so on, and they are empowered. And so he attributes this, you see, to the economic system and reproduction system. And that was, there are plenty of room here, please. This was really something very important that was brought into the discussion besides the demographical aspects. And so what we, and I was in this group, we tried to understand was the diversity of the diverging system, because it is not enough to say that you have unilinear system on one hand and diverging on the other hand. The reality is that in the European system you have two basically different systems which were shown in many places in Europe. For instance, you have in southern areas, if you think of south of France, northern of Spain, but also in some German Alps or Swiss Alps, some parts of Italy, and so on, what we call this impartible system, with a preference given to the male heir. And this coheres with what they call the STEM family system, which means those households that you find in the census list with 3 generations cohabiting. And very often you have the father and mother, the old couple. Then you have the heir, the man with his wife and children. And then you have bachelor sisters and brothers who are more or less treated like servants. Or these are areas which are which know a lot of out-migrations, because those bachelor children who do not get anything from the land, well, they move away to other countries in the world, or they go into the army, or they turn priests, for instance. So, and this system, in this system, the heir is not really the possessor, the owner of the land. He's just somebody who passes the land, which should remain undivided from one generation to another. And one of the maybe best texts of Pierre Bourdieu, and you know that Bourdieu is difficult to read, in my opinion, but one of his first works was about celibacy in Béarn, the south region of France, where he was talking of the total change in the 1960s of the position of these men who were heirs, but women didn't want to marry them anymore, you see, because they were only taking care of their farms and not enough of their wives, you see. So if you have a chance to read this book, which I think has been translated in English and has been published under the title like the Ball of the bachelors, it's a very interesting book to read about this inheritance topic, system. So this is one of the systems that was found in Europe. And the other system, which belonged to the area which I studied in Brittany, was the system du ménage, where it's an egalitarian pattern where all children, either at the moment of their marriage or at the moment of the death of their parents, all inherit the same share, and they try to reproduce the farms. And in the case of the area I studied, you see, which was an area with very high fertility, very high demography, the system can work only because the farmers are not owners of their farm, which means they don't have to share the farm in 8 children, because the children just move from one farm to take a lease when possible, and this is how the system could function. So this is an example of the works that was carried on in the 70s, 80s, 90s to present this diversity of European diverging inheritance pattern, and that gave the occasion of very rich debates, conferences, international conferences, and books produced. And every time there were new topics which were brought into the discussions: the mode of land tenure, the moment of devolution, the system of marriages that were practiced. For instance, in the case of the impartible system, you would have this duet. A boy is the heir, and his sister gets a dowry, and they belong to, let's say, household A. And then you have household B, where the heir is a heiress, a woman, and the boy gets a dowry. So of course you will make a match, which was really found when historical demography was developed. You could really see the amount of those double marriages, where the heir of household A marries the bachelor of household B, and the reverse. And it really turned out that the dowries which were supposed to be exchanged were never exchanged, because the peasants kept their money, and it was only a notary act where they said they had given the dowry, but in fact they never had done it. So this was particular to those areas where there was a lot of, it's not really in marriage, but rather a system of double marriages. And in the case of Brittany, I worked very much on the question of what we call relinking of marriages, which meant like a rather closed area that was encompassing between, let's say, 5 or 6 what we call communes, which means, villages and their territories, where there were about 30 or 40 families who would constantly exchange marriage partners, and people were, and I remember when I did field work, they told me very often that, where did you find your partner, your marriage partner? Oh, I found him because he's the cousin of the cousin of the sister-in-law of the bride, and we both were invited to the marriage, and this is how we met. Oh, what a chance, what a chance. So it's really only social hazard, so to speak. And so this was really a topic which was very important, which developed in the 1970s, 1890s. And then after that, there was so much research on those topics that really the attention was dropped. And now history has gone back much more to, let's say, traditional history of political history. And anthropology is doing something else. And as Vitis mentioned, you know that what happened with David Schneider criticism that was published in the 1984 and the critics that ended dismissing all possibilities of studying kinship. And this is really what happened in American academia, that they stopped altogether saying, okay, kinship is a topic that doesn't exist because we have always put our Occidental values on what we studied in exotic countries. So there is no topic. And then in academia, really, they stopped teaching kinship. For our great chance in France, we don't read English or don't speak English. So we didn't read Schneider. So we were convinced that kinship was still here. And anyway, the analysis by Schneider relates very much to what is American kinship, which is really linked, I believe, to a history of mobility, and that the motto in America was "Go West, young man." And in France, we're always really flabbergasted when we understand that people in families see one another only once a year for Thanksgiving, for instance, and this would seem something rather incredible in France, where kinship ties are very developed, as I will say. So what happened to me was that while I was doing my fieldwork in Brittany, I was asked, as Vitis said, I was asked by a prominent French sociologist, Henri Madras, to write a textbook in this collection called Collection U, like in university, the first Sociologie de la Famille, which I wrote in the first edition I wrote in 1981, and it was translated, well, the first edition only, unfortunately, was translated in many languages, very often under the title Historical Anthropology of the Family. And kinship is so much changing in France that over the years I've been asked to revise the book, and I'm in the process of publishing the 9th edition of Sociologie de la Famille, and it looks a little bit like a strange baby because there are still old pieces which are left, and then I insert new pieces and so on. But I can tell you that over the years, family sociology, the look on family practices and so on, have tremendously changed in France, and this is really very interesting. And this, in the course of research, which was maybe more socio-anthropological, I won't make a difference, this brought me to participate in a French research analyzing the various facets of family exchanges between 3 generations and observing the changes over time. And that was a research which was based on a national sample representative of 3-generation French families, of which we extracted 100 families, of true 3 generations, which means that I participated in those interviews, going back to see the families of the 75, the 50, and one child who had left the family. And what came out of this book, which is with Claudine Athias-Donfu, which unfortunately was not translated into English, is the importance of the figure of grandparents and grandparenting. And we have since expanded our work on this topic, which for reasons I'm not going to develop here, have never been treated by sociologists who prefer to treat more glamorous questions such as why don't they marry, same-sex companionship and so on. So they want to treat more sexy questions than dealing with grandparents, which means dealing with old people. So, you see, kinship never left me, and I was very interested to participate in these 3 generations. And then, suddenly also, I was asked, in continuity with this sociological interest, to participate at the turn of the century. So it began before a little bit before 2000, and it went on for 5 or 7 years. And the publication date of the research has been 2010, you see, already 8 years time goes by. And so I was asked to participate in an international comparative endeavor. And this is also something which I thought was very interesting because it was on the European level. CAS, Kinship and Social Security, which was launched by Patrick Heddy at the initiative of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle. So these were some of the questions that were put on because it was a program which was financed by YPCRD, European Program Research Policy. So it was Europe who was funding it. And so we had to put some very general questions and issues to convince the people in Brussels to give us money. So these were one of the questions that were put. The general idea was to compare throughout 8 countries in Europe what was the relative importance of family health and in relation with law policies, you see. And so social dimension, intergenerational exchange, relationship between partners and their family, between individual and society. You can see that the aim is absolutely enormous and the ambition is enormous. How people respond to practical choices from policy and economic change and in relation, you see, with these big topics. The idea being also to understand what was going on when social policies regarding family and family health change. So next one will be, this was only to frame, don't go away, don't go. This was only to frame the comparative research. You see that there existed this ESSP where you can find figures of, for instance, fertility rates and so on in Europe. And then something that goes on still now, this is this program which is called SHARE, Survey of Health, Aging and Retirement in Europe, that brings forward the question of help with the help to the old people and what goes on, because it is one of the key questions when we discuss intergenerational relationship and health. Then next slide, and I will finish with that. Voila. So you had 8 countries which were involved. Some countries had only 1 field site, some had 2, some had 3. In France, we were very lucky and endowed with 3 field sites. 5 is Nantere, because in Nantere, which is the place where I have been a professor, I had carried on a little urban study on Nantere city. So I knew some people there from my book in Nantere, so I had contact there, and so that was the urban field site which was selected. Then we had 6, which is a little town in France called Dole, near Besançon. And it's a middle-sized town where one of the researchers also had previously done fieldwork, so we could go back there and also re-interview people with whom we had contacts, and we didn't start a fresh fieldwork, you know, with all the time, it's so time-consuming. And then 7 was in the Pyrenees, precisely where we have that impartible system I mentioned, and that was one of the students of one of the professors who was doing her fieldwork in a little village. Then we had Italy, where we had South Italy and Milano, and then we had Germany with 2 field sites, Austria with 2 field sites, we had Poland, and we had Russia, and we had Sweden, so, and Croatia. So that were the 8 field sites that were selected for the reason. Maybe we can try next one. Voilà. And so this is important. The technique which seduced the Brussels technicians was that we said, we're there with a computer. Okay, it's really going to be scientific then. This is why they financed us. And we as researchers, we had met first in Halle to establish a questionnaire, what they call the Penkių, kinship network questionnaire, which we brought on our laptop to see our interview, the people we interviewed. And we have this laptop, and we have the question we had to put to ego, we had first to understand, to know who were all the people he could name as kin people, you see. My wife, my sister, my brother, my children, my aunt, my great-aunt, my grandparents' aunt. And the first batch of questions, which was initially thought of, was, look, you're going to press a key when you say, yes, I have assisted to the burial of that grand-aunt. Yes, I have assisted to the marriage of this nephew. So these were the questions initially put. And then I must say that, unfortunately, the people in Halle who were in charge of the informatics took over the questionnaire, and without our knowing it, us, the researchers, they put in a lot of additional questions. For instance, who does the shopping? Is it you or is it your wife? Daily, weekly, etc., etc. How often do you see these people? And we had to, for each person which was entered in the kinship group, we had to say, how far does he live from your home? What is his education? And so on and so on. So by the time we had finished the laptop inquiry, because young students were paid to do that, well, there was hardly any time to really do some field work, more going to see schools and so on, what happened. And whenever we had finished one Penkių and sent it to Halle, well, Halle would send back the questionnaire and say, look, you haven't answered question 32B. So all the questionnaires had to be totally completed. So altogether, the idea was on each field site to collect 30 ego-centered genealogical networks. And over the 8 countries and their field sites, we gathered 570 networks altogether. And these Penkiŭs have been used by, I would say, the central team of demographers in Halle to publish the last of the 3 books that I will mention at the end. And you see, we had to record assistance given to and received from each network member, all the social interaction, background information, and data were collected. It took 2 years, and they could be analyzed at individual or area level. To be true, we as people who were involved in the research did not get very much feedback from Halle, because you can very well see that if I have 30 questionnaires in Nantere, 30 questionnaires, 80,000 people, not representative, 1 minute. The questionnaire which is representative is that of the Pyrenees, because when that young woman who is now a researcher of the CNRS interviewed the 30 people, you could really say it was representative of a whole village. So you see, to me, and I think that this work was to me, and maybe we can stop here, okay, and have like, to me it was the project was extremely interesting in the idea that for the first time we could have something comparative and at a European level, but I think that all the work that was involved in that really didn't bring all the hopes that were put in it. We had 3 books. The first book, and I was involved in all 3 books, was devoted to studying social policies in each country. And that was very interesting in view, for instance, of Germany, who was experiencing at that time very many changes in social policies regarding kinship, child care, old people care, and so on, because they were moving from the Eastern model to the Western model. And in the case of child care, for instance, a lot of child care in Soviet time and no child care when Germany was reunited. So these were very interesting moments, you see, to study. And of course, we have to understand that France has an incredible welfare state, which is uncomparable to anything else in Europe. So this is how the research went on, and it produced, so I said, the first volume was on the social policies regarding kinship. The second volume was the volume of the monographies, and this is where you can find some elements of comparison, for instance, because the monographies were describing the family reactions, and they were dealing with, and these were the moments where once we had finished with our damned Penkių, we could discuss with people if we had some time. And besides, for instance, in the case of France, something that was really missing was questions about secondary homes, because in France, lots of families, and it's not only wealthy families, have houses to take care of the grandchildren during the holidays and so on. And these are very important moments of interaction, intercourse between generations. And this question was not set, you see, on the agenda of the questions. So, of course, it came during discussions and so on. And it turned out, eventually, that the hypothesis that was put forth didn't really, was not really, I would say, demonstrated. They used the vocabulary of crowding out or crowding in. Crowding out meant crowding out family, and crowding in, bringing in family. And so the hypothesis was like countries like Sweden, for instance, who have a very important welfare state. It meant we would expect that family was not present, for instance, in the case of old age. But it didn't turn out that way. Not only was there welfare state, but there was also family. So you see, the idea of trying to find, well, if it is a result, it's a result, it's a scientific result, and it's interesting, to show that kinship is important in whatever, but of course in different ways, the level of state aid regarding regarding the care of children, and regarding the care of aging people. But of course, behind this gross conclusion, what was shown in the monographies, for instance, is that the emotion which was put in those situations was different from country to country. For instance, grandparenting, as we had shown before, was very much valued in the case of France, where grandparents are always mourning that they don't have grandchildren, because women, have children more and more late in their lives now. And grandparenting is very much valued. Whereas we had a researcher showed that grandparenting in Eastern countries, former Soviet countries, was not valued that much, because it meant rather, it referred in those years, you see years 2000, so only 10 years after the political changes, that the older people had time to take care of their grandchildren. That didn't mean that they loved their grandchildren, but it meant that rather they were unemployed, that their own children had found jobs, and so they had to take care of their grandchildren to help their own children, but it was not done with the same emotional context that was done in the case of France, for instance. So this was something I think very interesting. So I will stop in a few minutes. You see, we found, and that was an important conclusion that really shows the importance of kinship, that it is related, really, it's not only a question of emotion, it is a question of emotion, of course, but the comparative research helped really illuminate the various representations and values around it. But it shows also that it is connected to labor market, women's labor, and that was really one of the basic questions, you see. What happens in kinship systems when women are now not free to take care of families the way they used to do for many, many generations. So that was very well shown by the various monographies. And if the books are here in your library, I think you should try to have a look at those books, which were published in English in 2010. Now, I will briefly address a new topic, which is not only European, but that is rather a question of global kinship. And it is a study that I am, a topic in which I am investing myself now, which are the questions related to the NRT, the new reproductive technologies. And suddenly kinship, again, which was always associated with something boring and traditional, suddenly is enhanced with modern colors. And it really sends us back to this basic question of what is kinship, what is filiation, what is descent, what is the relative part of social kinship and biological kinship, and so on. And so these questions in the 2000s were dealt with really and opened with the questions of adoptions. And there was a lot of research which was done on adoption, and notably international adoption, because here again, in all European countries, at least whether it's the case in France, adoption was very, very limited in view of French young children, and so the parents had to go outside in those years when sometimes it was rather easy to get a child and have the child brought back, but anyway, a child that is not of the color of your skin, and how do you integrate this child as a citizen? And that was a research that was mainly done by a Norwegian anthropologist called Signe Howell, who used the term of kinning. How do you make kin of a child which is not physically of the same as you? But the questions now, new questions are set by the extraordinary changes in biotechnologies, and they go absolutely beyond the family circle and impinge on society in a world of globalization and commodification of the human body. And in the case of France, this is a hotly debated topic, and it's going to be hotly debated within the forthcoming months, because we have a discussion which takes place every 4 years, I think, on the bioethics law, and there is a discussion right now which is ahead of us. The research started in United Kingdom, really, with Marilyn Strathern, who wrote a book which was rather prophetic in 1992, where she examined the consequences of the technicization of nature, and her book is called After Nature. And ever since, I think that things have developed from the question of insemination, artificial insemination for couples in which the husband is infertile, and also now, that is the case which is set in France, the case of lesbian women who have recourse to insemination. And in relation to this topic, a topic which is coming up is the question of the anonymity of the donor of sperm, and which is a law in France that donors are anonymous. And research is going on among the numerous associations of children which were born thanks to these techniques, and who claim they want to know who their genitor is, though this is forbidden by French law, and this revives the old debate of social and biological filiation. Now, if you consider the case of in vitro fertilization, it has been a tremendous help for infertile couples to have babies, but the practice has drifted away into a huge worldwide business where the poorer women are exploited by the richer. The desire, and this I can't expand because it should be a conference in itself, a topic in itself. Suddenly, the desire to become parents has popped up in contemporary societies, and sterility is not accepted anymore. I don't know if it is because of all those cinema stars who appear to be pregnant, show themselves in bikinis when they're 9 months pregnant and so on, but the thing is that being parents seems to be now something of à la mode, I would say. And couples now who cannot be parents are dealing with agencies that can provide mothers and provide, if necessary, genes, because genes could be either and or plus the sperm and also the ovocytes in case the mother has also a fertility problem. Is the desire enough to justify these procedures? And then we come up with the questions beyond the question of exploitation of women's body. In the case of France, surrogacy is prohibited, but parents do go abroad in the States if they are very rich, in India if they are not as rich, and if they are in Ukraine, if they are not as rich, or in Laos or Cambodia, Nepal, if they are not rich at all, and to bring their babies. And this, I would say, are like some bumps against the French law, because those parents come back and they are in associations and they fight the French law in order to have the children born in contradiction to the French law, but to be written on their civil status as their own children. And of course, if the French law accepts this, to provide a French civil status to those children, then the idea that surrogacy is forbidden just blows up, you know. Well, and so besides in France, the law prohibits the contractualization of bodies, whereas the idea of putting a contract on a woman's body is accepted in England and in the States and elsewhere. So the contribution, I would say that the anthropologists have two contributions to these debates. They are called upon to provide their views in the name of the expertise they have built over decades on kinship. So one of their contributions is to provide a theoretical comparative framework to situate the changes we would be observing in Europe in comparison to practices that take place in the societies that have been studied over time. And as you know, many anthropologists studied the representations of procreation. Malinowski is very well known for having shown, is it true or not, that they had no representation, that it was the male who was giving sperm, but it was gods that made the women pregnant and so on. So in all societies, the anthropologists have studied these kinship practices and representation, and this is then in the name of their knowledge, they can justify the implied changes in kinship in Europe in case of why should we worry there is no father in case of assisted infertility of lesbian women, why worry there is no mother in case of gay parents. Don't be conservative, see how in African or Asian societies they manage to treat sterility. They also take the examples of African societies where it is quite known that children circulate between lines, and very often they are not brought up by their genetic parents, but they are brought up by grandmothers, uncles, and so on, because those children really belong to clans before they belong to a couple. So you see, they use their expertise to say, look, in the variety of societies we've known throughout the world, they don't worry, and this will be a change, but don't worry. And this is something that I don't agree with. And another contribution of anthropology is now to do field work, to uncover the processes from the parents' design to the production of children. So one of the issues which was published right after this one was devoted to new reproductive technologies, and we have had investigations of the way young women who give their oversight fantasize about what happens with this gift, which is really, it's not a gift because it is done against money, this procedure. And there are investigations on the discourses of the doctors which are operating in those agencies. I have done myself research on the vocabulary which is used to set in the head of the women who are going to let their body use, so that they are taught by the agencies to use the vocabulary of gift, of hiding totally the monies, the flow of money that goes on behind. And so I am, anthropologists also have been very often in their fieldwork some militants of some causes. For instance, there have been some trials regarding the African practices of excision for women, and anthropologists went then to testify. So the anthropologists now are divided in two groups. One is a militant group associated with militant groups of what we call LGBT, lesbian, gay, and so forth, and another group to which I belong, we are denouncing the market of women, of human beings, women and children who become objects circulating within an international genes which can be bought here and there, and you already have cases absolutely horrifying of genes bought in Denmark, because in Denmark there is no anonymity of the donor, so you can buy the sperm of a young, bright, tall, blonde, blue-eyed man, and then you buy the ovocytes in Spain, and they are assembled somewhere, and then they're put in the mother's womb somewhere else. And these are incredible examples which have been really studied now. So you see, whatever we in our group, we are pleading for the universal abolition of this practice, because this has no reason, there is no way to suppress it in India, because then you will find poorer women in other poorer countries. So this is one of our fights, and it's a political fight. And I try also to uncover the genealogy of the militant lobbying which works very much on the public through years and years of debate presented in the press to make those practices acceptable, and this is also an interesting topic. So you see, all three topics I have described here are examples of the way you can deal with kinship, which even if David Schneider doesn't agree with me, is an existing and still a very contemporary topic, and I will be happy to discuss with you some of the aspects of those topics which are very different. You might be interested in asking more questions if I can answer. And again, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Segalen. So, floor is open for questions, and please, I really feel that all three questions, all three topics, not questions dealt here, are of interest, and even classic perspectives from the very beginning they are educational enough to discuss it again and again, and not talk about the last issue what you dealt a lot, not a lot, but still very in very kind of applied science perspective, as applied anthropology perspective is of great importance to me, because of we as researchers, of course, should be taking care of what's going on after your research is done, and not only during your research is done, how life is going on, how life is changing, and this is a very hard topic you dealt with. So, please. If not yet any questions, my question would be first on what you mentioned about grandparents and grandparenting issue. I remember Carole Lemaire submitted an article on how memory is jumping over generations, and how important is grandparenting in terms of live memories, how memory is in life, how memory is enacted, passed through generations, but not generation to generation, but jumping over generation. So grandparenting as jumping over generation in terms of memory was her argument. So my question would be similar too on this grandparenting in contemporary systems of social research, in contemporary systems of social networking. What you mentioned about the emotional part of the difference in between France and the former Soviet bloc. Could you please relate on that in very kind of contemporary situation, how it is? with grandparenting?
I was dwelling, and she was one of the researchers of the CAS program. Her name is Tatiana Telen.
Yes, from Berlin.
Yeah, from Berlin now. She was a young student at that time, and she was studying the question of grandparenting, and I was very interested because we had just finished our investigation on grandparenting, showing the extreme emotional importance which is put in France in this relation, given the fact that we have, if we think of what are grandparents useful for, let's say, to take care of grandchildren, and yet we have in France an excellent daycare system, even though we know that all young mothers who are pregnant are already, 2 days after they know they are pregnant, they're already registering their child in the next child care institution, but I mean, it's always a fight, but there are solutions. So grandparents never take care in France of grandchildren on a daily basis. This might have been the model in the 1950s when women would work and then they would leave behind their children in the countryside with their grandparents because they had nobody to take care of the grandchildren in the cities. But now grandparents are not used on a daily basis, but they interfere very often in case of difficulties, and also, as I said, in the emotional moments of holidays through house. And again, being a grandparent is very much valued. When you hear men who become grandparents at the age of, at the moment they retire, they say, look, I have never, I didn't see my own children grow, so this time I'm going to invest myself in my grandchild. And those grandparents, they are young enough, they still enjoy nice, good pensions, and so they're going to go, and the image of the grandfather and grandmother has totally evolved because the old person is the great-grandparent then. And so they say, I'm going to ski with my grandchildren or fish and so on. And so the emotional investment is very important. And the case that Tatiana described was this change in the fact that you were obliged to be a grandparent in those year 2000s because there was no child care, and suddenly this job market was changing and jobs were open for young people who had children, but who was going to take care of the grandchildren? And grandfathers and grandmothers didn't want, they did not invest emotionally their status as a grandfather, but rather it was a sign that they were ousted of society, of productive society, which was one of the status sign, regular status sign in Soviet times, I think. So this is where this idea of having, of Patrick Heddy to have countries where there were important changes was important. And we had the same effects with Croatia also with, as consequences also, residential strategies. This is interesting to see that even in Paris, in such a huge market, young generations try to, as much as they can afford living in Paris, but then more generally, the young couples who start having children, or the aging parents who don't need such a space, they all manage never to live together, never, but manage to be not too far away in case of helping one another. So it is interesting, so this is brings us to something else, that kinship is really associated to social things, social items of the society so important, such as residence and work. And of course, it is totally associated also with the changes with women, females' work. France has a long experience of women's work and started earlier than in other countries, but now it's something that is not even to be discussed. I think that women who are graduating from universities will work and will want to work and will have to work because two salaries are better than one.
I have a question on the last topic you talked about with specifically surrogacy and other things related to this. I don't know if you've seen, they did this TV show called based on The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, and it's kind of been a revolution in America.
On the what? On
The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood's
The
book.
Handmaid what?
The Handmaid's Tale. It's a dystopian novel.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, I heard about it.
Yeah. It talks about how there's like this new society in America where women are forced to essentially be
And the girls have
exactly. So it
yeah.
started this kind of whole new idea of this surrogacy thing in America. But I find it interesting that we still have at the same time, it's these progressive people who are really liking this, but at the same time it's these progressive people who are the LGBTQ activists who are coming up with this discourse that we need these options, we have to have these options. If you don't like these options, you're anti-gay, you're anti-lesbian, etc. So how can we mitigate this paradoxical notion within specifically American society and also other societies where they can disagree and yet fully support this idea? What can we as anthropologists or sociologists do to help mitigate this?
Well, this is a very difficult question. How, on the power of anthropologists, sociologists, in front of questions which I think finally, eventually, will be dependent on politicians. But we have exactly the same debate. Whenever you would say one thing about surrogacy, it is that you are homophobic and rightist and so on. So, and the question you're putting is also related to debates regarding feminism. After all, if women accept their just, you know, the ones who say prostitution, okay, they're free to do whatever they want with their body and let them do it. And again, let them do it if they want to, you know, be a surrogate mother. And then we have this discourse, and if you're mentioning this book, I would mention another one then, which is by Reinhold Jean Daniel. And though it was published by a French publisher, it's in English, New Cannibal Markets, Globalization and Commodification of the Human Body. And this is exactly where it starts with kidneys. It goes on, it has been always going on, let's say, with hair. Hair. I mean, in Brittany, where I did my field study, in the 19th century, women would sell their hair because it was used by people who would make wigs for elegant people and so on. And so, well, but the question of selling babies is something, we are in another realm. And anthropologists have their say, and I have, though I'm no celebrity, don't worry, I have entered the discussion because for the time being, anthropologists were only associated with the LGBT movement to promote this, and they have been writing and having papers and so on. So we belong to another group which is associated with socialists and communists, so that we are not associated with this movement called in France le mariage pour la... Comment il s'appelle, Gerdrey, le mouvement? C'est pas le mariage pour tous, c'est le mouvement contre. Comment il s'appelle? Well, there was a very strong Catholic movement march against what we have had, what we call the mariage pour tous, the gay marriage, which eventually was accepted as a law in 2013. But we had demonstration, 1.5 million people demonstrating against it. So, which, though it's not the whole population, it was really recuperated, I would say, by rightist Catholics. Whereas we are trying to develop with other colleagues and a group which is not affiliated with this group and representing another trend, you see. But at least I think we have managed to have our voice heard a little bit, whereas there was only this discourse, which was, of course, we must organize an ethical contract for women, where we have demonstrated that there is no ethical contract whatsoever. Of course, you can always have one case where your sister will accept to do this for you, but legally it is just impossible. It is forbidden by French law. And when you look at what the contracts are in some cases in the States, it is incredible. You know, it is going to the details. How if you make love with your husband while you are pregnant, are you going to dye your hair? What are you eating? And so on. It is a total prison for the woman. And in the case of India, it goes to things like the women are paid at the regarding in function of the weight of the baby. The baby is bigger, she gets more money. So you just, and really anthropology has been very useful in that sense. And of course with debates, because in India, for instance, okay, it was shown that it was not necessarily the poor women who did it. That of course, instead of, producing our blue jeans for a rice bowl, by being pregnant, they get more money. So some feminists said this is empowerment for them, because, and at least for 8 months they are in a room, they are fed, they can stay in bed. So what the others say is that the money, we are in patriarchal society, the money goes, maybe it is the husband who wants his wife to go there, and he's the one who gets the money, or it is the mother-in-law. And if you look at also of all the medical aspects of this thing, you know, they are fed with hormones, they have cesarean birth systematically and so on. So anthropology, ethnography of those practices were interesting to understand both sides. But again, I think it is the politicians who have to make the last decision.
What's the name of your group?
Yeah, it's called CORP, CORP, C-O-R-P, with a big O, I think, or a big R. And really the prominent person there is a philosopher called Sylvia Nagasinski, who happens to be the wife of former Prime Minister Lionel Jospin, if you... so...
Merci.